The autumn sun was setting behind the courthouse windows as the familiar scent of old leather-bound law books filled the air. Inside her chambers, Judge Patricia Reynolds gently massaged her temples, taking a brief moment away from the stack of case files that had become her constant companions. The antique desk clock, a gift from her grandmother, ticked softly in the background, marking another long day serving justice. For 15 years, she had sat on this bench, earning every milestone through pure determination. Growing up on the south side of the city, she'd watched her mother work 3 jobs to put her through law school. Those memories still fueled her, especially on challenging days like this one. The wooden walls of her chambers held stories that few could see. The countless nights she'd spent preparing for cases, the moments of doubt she'd pushed through, and the small victories that had gradually built her reputation as one of the most respected judges in the state. Her colleagues often joked that she was always the last to leave the building, but they knew it wasn't just about the work. It was about responsibility. Looking up at the Warren family photo on her desk, she smiled at the image of her parents at her swearing-in ceremony. Their proud faces reminded her of how far they'd all come. Her father, a retired postal worker, had always told her, "Baby girl, you're going to change things from the inside." Those words had become her compass, guiding her through the lonely years when she was the only black female judge in the district. That evening, as she reviewed a particularly complex custody case, her law clerk knocked gently on the door. "Judge Reynolds, your next case file is ready, but maybe it's time to call it a day." The young clerk's concern was genuine. It was already past 7, and the courthouse halls had grown quiet hours ago. The judge looked down at her notebook, where she'd been sketching out ideas for a community youth program. She believed in more than just passing judgment. She wanted to prevent young people from entering the system in the first place. Her latest initiative involved partnering with local schools to teach students about the law, their rights, and the importance of civic engagement. Running her fingers over her mother's old prayer beads, which she kept in her desk drawer for good luck, Judge Reynolds thought about all the small choices that had led her here. The extra study sessions in law school, the pro bono cases she took as a young attorney, the mentors who had believed in her when others doubted. Each step had prepared her for this role. She was known for taking time with each case, digging deeper than the surface to understand the human stories behind the legal documents. Her colleagues sometimes teased her about her thorough approach, but her fair rulings had earned her respect across the legal community. Even the most seasoned attorneys knew that in her courtroom, justice wasn't just about following the letter of the law. It was about understanding its spirit. As she finally gathered her things to leave, Judge Reynolds paused at her office door, looking back at the wall of certificates and awards. But it wasn't the accolades that made her proud. It was the thank you letters from families whose lives she'd impacted, carefully preserved in a simple folder on her desk. Those heartfelt words meant more than any official recognition. Little did she know that this ordinary evening would be her last normal day for a while. The events about to unfold would test everything she believed in, challenge her faith in the system she served, and ultimately transform not just her life, but her entire community's approach to justice. The street lights flickered on as Judge Reynolds drove her navy blue sit-in through the quiet neighborhoods. The digital clock on her dashboard read 8:45 p.m., another late night at the courthouse. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she'd skipped dinner again, too caught up in reviewing case files. She thought about stopping at her favorite diner, the one where they still served breakfast all day. The roads were nearly empty, with just a few cars passing by. She had driven this route hundreds of times, knowing every turn and traffic light by heart. The local radio station played soft jazz, and she hummed along, thinking about tomorrow's heavy court schedule. Her mind wandered to the young defendant's case she'd been reviewing, another kid who needed guidance more than punishment. That's when the red and blue lights started flashing in her rearview mirror. At first, she was confused. She'd been driving exactly at the speed limit, a habit she developed over years of being extra careful. She signaled and pulled over smoothly, making sure to stop in a well-lit area near a convenience store. Following the protocol she'd advised countless others to use, Judge Reynolds kept her hands visible on the steering wheel. She watched in her side mirror as two officers approached, one on each side of her car. Something felt off about their aggressive stance, but she remained calm, drawing from years of courtroom experience in tense situations. License and registration, the first officer demanded, his flashlight beam almost blinding as he shined it directly into her face. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop. Judge Reynolds noticed he kept his other hand near his weapon, despite her calm demeanor. "Of course, officer," she replied steadily, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "My documentation is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for it now." She narrated her actions clearly, just as she taught others to do in her legal education workshops. As she reached for her purse, the second officer tensed up, barking, "Keep your hands where we can see them." The contradiction in commands was jarring. How could she both show her documentation and keep her hands visible? "Officers, I'm Judge Patricia Reynolds from the Superior Court," she explained calmly, trying to diffuse the situation. "I'm simply reaching for my identification as requested." The mention of her position seemed to agitate them further rather than ease the tension. The first officer scoffed. "Sure you are. And I'm the Chief Justice." His sarcasm cut through the night air. Despite her years commanding respect in the courtroom, she was being treated like a criminal, her words dismissed without consideration. When she finally managed to retrieve her judicial ID along with her driver's license, the officers barely glanced at them. Their flashlight beams bounced off her court credentials, the gold seal clearly visible, but they acted as if they were examining counterfeit documents. The situation escalated when Judge Reynolds reached for her phone, intending to call the chief of police, someone she'd worked with on numerous community initiatives. "Step out of the vehicle," the second officer demanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. She could feel her heart racing now, but her voice remained steady. Years of maintaining composure in high-stakes courtroom situations had prepared her for this moment, though she never imagined she'd need those skills during a routine traffic stop. Through the store window, she could see the clerk watching worriedly, phone in hand. The security cameras above silently recorded everything, a detail that would later prove crucial. But in that moment, none of her accomplishments, position, or knowledge of the law seemed to matter. She was about to experience firsthand the very injustice she had worked so hard to eliminate from her courtroom. As the situation spiraled beyond reason, Judge Reynolds thought of all the cases she'd heard involving similar scenarios. But this time, she wasn't behind the bench, she was living it. And the next few minutes would change not just her life, but spark a movement that would shake the very foundation of local law enforcement. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Judge Reynolds' wrists as she stood in disbelief next to her car. The same hands that had spent the day signing court orders were now being restrained behind her back. The convenience store's neon signs cast an eerie glow over the scene, while passing cars slowed down to watch the unfolding drama. "You're making a serious mistake," she said firmly, maintaining her dignity despite humiliation. Her voice carried the same authority it held in the courtroom. But here, on this dark street corner, it fell on deaf ears. The officers seemed more interested in making a point than listening to reason. Her phone lay on the car hood where she'd placed it, still showing the unfinished dial to her lawyer's number. One of the officers picked it up and powered it off, cutting off her attempt to reach help. The simple act of trying to make a phone call, a basic right she defended for countless others, had somehow been twisted into resisting arrest. The convenience store clerk had come outside now, standing nervously by the door. Judge Reynolds could see him filming with his phone, providing another witness to this surreal scene. She silently thanked him for his courage, knowing how important documentation would be later. Inside the patrol car, the reality of her situation hit hard. The back seat was uncomfortable, designed for submission rather than dignity. Through the partition, She could hear the officers radioing in their version of events, describing her as uncooperative and hostile. Each word they spoke was a stark contradiction to the truth, but they were the ones controlling the narrative, at least for now. She thought about her mother's words from years ago. "Baby, no matter how high you climb, some people will only see how far they want to bring you down." Those words had never felt more true than in this moment. Her judicial robes, her years of service, her dedication to justice, none of it had protected her from this fundamental abuse of power. The drive to the police station was both endless and too quick. Judge Reynolds watched familiar streets pass by through the window, streets where she'd driven countless times on her way to and from the courthouse. Now she was seeing them from an entirely different perspective, from the other side of the law. At the station, the booking process was deliberately slow. She recognized the tactic from her days as a defense attorney. The longer they took, the more degrading the experience became. The fingerprinting, the mugshot, the confiscation of her jewelry, including her grandmother's ring, each step was designed to strip away dignity. But they couldn't strip away her knowledge of the law or her inner strength. As they led her to a holding cell, Judge Reynolds began mentally documenting every violation of procedure, every skipped step, every ignored right. Her judicial mind was already building the case that would later shake the department to its core. The cell was cold and bare, with a hard bench and harsh fluorescent lighting. She sat there, still in her court clothes, a blazer and pencil skirt that now felt like costume pieces from another life. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she'd have been presiding over cases in her courtroom. Now she was sitting in a cell, charged with disorderly conduct for simply asserting her rights. From down the hall, she could hear officers laughing and chatting, seemingly unbothered by the fact that they had just arrested a sitting judge without cause. Their casual attitude spoke volumes about the systemic problems she would soon be fighting to change. Hours passed before anyone came to inform her of her rights, rights she could have recited in her sleep. But she stayed silent, knowing that everything happening now would become part of a much bigger story. Every minute she spent in that cell strengthened her resolve to fight not just for herself, but for every person who had ever faced similar injustice without her advantages of legal knowledge and community standing. Through the small window in her cell, she could see the first hints of dawn breaking. A new day was coming, and with it would come a reckoning that none of these officers had anticipated. They thought they were booking just another arrest, but they had actually lit the fuse of a movement that would transform their entire department. The morning news hit like a thunderclap. The convenience store security footage had found its way to every major news outlet in the city. The grainy video showed everything: the unnecessary aggression, the ignored credentials, the unjustified arrest. By sunrise, Judge Reynolds' story was everywhere, from local morning shows to social media feeds across the country. The courthouse steps became a sea of reporters and cameras. Fellow judges, who had worked alongside her for years, stood in shock as they watched the footage play on their phones. The young clerk who had urged her to go home early the previous evening fought back tears while talking to reporters, describing the judge's dedication to justice and her community work. Inside the courthouse break room, the small TV that usually played quietly in the background now commanded everyone's attention. The security footage played on loop, a respected judge being handcuffed outside her car, her calm dignity visible even in the grainy nighttime recording. Court officers who had worked with her for years shook their heads in disbelief. Her phone, finally returned after her release, wouldn't stop buzzing. Text messages, voicemails, emails, all expressing outrage and support. The local bar association had already issued a strongly worded statement. Civil rights leaders were calling for immediate action. But what caught everyone's attention most was the footage from the convenience store's indoor camera. This second angle showed something the police hadn't noticed: the clear view of Judge Reynolds' judicial ID being dismissed by the officers. The timestamp matched perfectly with her calm explanation of her position. The footage also captured the officers' dismissive laughs, their aggressive stance, all while the judge maintained her composure. By midday, social media was ablaze. The hashtag Justice for Judge Reynolds was trending. People were sharing their own stories of similar encounters. But what made this case different was the irrefutable evidence. There was no room for the usual excuses or alternative explanations. The videos told the whole story. The police department's first press conference was a disaster. Their spokesperson tried to stick to the official story, claiming the judge had been uncooperative. But reporters weren't having it. They had all seen the videos. Every attempt to justify the officers' actions was met with direct quotes from the footage that contradicted their claims. Local community leaders began organizing peaceful protests outside the police station. Among the crowds were faces Judge Reynolds recognized from her courtroom: lawyers, bailiffs, even former defendants who had appeared before her, all united in their outrage at her treatment. The convenience store clerk became an unexpected hero. In interviews, he described how he had instinctively known something was wrong and decided to record everything. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," he told reporters. Here was this professional woman, clearly explaining who she was, being treated like she didn't matter. By evening, national news networks had picked up the story. Legal experts appeared on TV, breaking down every violation of protocol, every ignored right, every moment where the officers should have, de-escalated the situation. The footage became a teaching moment, a clear example of what law enforcement wasn't supposed to do. Support poured in from unexpected places. Police chiefs from other cities condemned the officers' actions. Retired judges shared similar stories they'd never spoken about before. Even politicians who usually stayed quiet on such issues felt compelled to speak out. The evidence was too clear to ignore. Through it all, Judge Reynolds maintained her characteristic grace. She didn't call for revenge or retribution. Instead, she spoke about change, about using this moment to create something positive. In her first public statement, delivered from her attorney's office, she said words that would be quoted countless times. "This isn't about one judge's bad night. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I went through, badge or no badge." The media storm was just beginning, but it was already clear that this story would be different. This wasn't going to be another incident that faded from the headlines after a few days. The combination of irrefutable evidence, the judge's impeccable reputation, and the growing mountain of community support was building into something that couldn't be ignored or swept away. The police department's internal affairs office had never seen such activity. Investigators worked overtime, poring over years of dashcam footage, arrest records, and civilian complaints. What started as an investigation into one incident quickly uncovered a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Files were spread across conference room tables, each one telling a similar story. The two officers who had arrested Judge Reynolds had a history, not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that showed up in the details. Traffic stops that lasted too long, searches without clear cause, complaints that had been dismissed without proper investigation. One young investigator found something particularly troubling in the data. She noticed that these officers' traffic stops followed a clear pattern. The numbers didn't lie. Certain neighborhoods, certain types of cars, certain times of night. Each piece of evidence added to a picture that became impossible to ignore. The department's computers hummed day and night as tech specialists combed through body camera footage from previous months. They found more instances of disrespect, more cases of ignored rights, more examples of unnecessary escalation. Judge Reynolds' arrest wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first one that couldn't be swept under the rug. In the break room, veteran officers whispered about the changes they could feel coming. Some defended their colleagues out of habit, but others knew this time was different. This wasn't just about public relations anymore. This was about fundamental change. The police chief's secretary watched as a steady stream of officials walked in and out of his office. City council members, community leaders, police union representatives, all demanding answers, all wanting to know how this could have happened. The chief, who had been planning to retire in a few months, now found himself at the center of a storm that would define his legacy. Internal Affairs investigators interviewed other officers who had worked with the two involved in Judge Reynolds' arrest. At first, there was the usual reluctance to speak up, but as the evidence mounted, more officers began to talk. They shared stories of comments made during shifts, of attitudes they had noticed but never reported. The department's training officer sat in stunned silence as she reviewed the footage of the arrest. Every protocol she had taught was ignored, every de-escalation technique forgotten. She made notes for future training sessions, determined that this incident would become a teaching tool for what not to do. In the records room, clerks discovered that several civilian complaints against these officers had been misfiled, coincidentally making them harder to find during previous reviews. The system that was supposed to catch problem officers had holes in it, holes that had been there for years. The internal investigation also revealed something unexpected. Officers who had tried to report problems before but were ignored or discouraged. These officers now stepped forward, sharing emails they had kept, notes they had taken, concerns they had raised that went nowhere. The police union representatives found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Usually quick to defend their members, they struggled to justify what the evidence clearly showed. The usual explanations about split-second decisions and officer safety didn't apply here. The videos showed deliberate choices made over several minutes. As the investigation deepened, it revealed issues beyond just these two officers. Problems with supervision, gaps in accountability, flaws in the complaint system. Each discovery led to another question, another area that needed examination. What started as an investigation of one incident had become a comprehensive review of the entire department's culture. By the third week, the investigation had generated so many documents that they had to request additional storage space on the department's servers. Each new piece of evidence, each interview transcript, each data analysis report added to a picture that would demand real change, not just cosmetic fixes. The Internal Affairs captain, a 30-year veteran, summed it up in his preliminary report. What happened to Judge Reynolds was not a failure of policy, but a failure of culture. And changing culture is much harder than changing policy. Those words would echo through the department's halls as they began to grapple with what real reform would mean. The law office buzzed with energy as Judge Reynolds sat with her legal team, her judicial robes replaced by a simple business suit. The conference room walls were covered with timeline charts, photos, and legal documents. This wasn't just about filing a lawsuit. It was about changing an entire system. Her lead attorney, a former colleague from her days practicing law, spread out the draft complaint on the table. This is bigger than just one wrongful arrest, she explained to the team. The document detailed not just the night of the arrest, but years of similar incidents that had been ignored or dismissed. Coffee cups littered the table as they worked late into the evening. Young lawyers fresh out of law school sat beside veteran civil rights attorneys, all drawn to a case they knew could make history. Their laptops glowed with research from similar cases across the country, looking for precedents they could use. The filing of the lawsuit made headlines, but what caught everyone's attention was its scope. This wasn't a simple complaint about one bad night. The legal team had crafted something much more ambitious. A challenge to the entire department's way of operating. Every page of the document told a story, backed by data, witnesses, and hard evidence. In the courthouse hallways, other judges watched with interest. Many had dealt with cases involving police misconduct before, but this was different. This time, one of their own was fighting back, armed with undeniable evidence and the knowledge of how the system really worked. The police department's lawyers looked worried as they reviewed the complaint. This wasn't something they could settle quietly. The evidence was too strong, the demands for change too specific. Traditional defense tactics wouldn't work against someone who knew the law as well as they did. Community members filled out affidavits, sharing their own experiences. The legal team's office became a place where people felt safe telling their stories, many for the first time. Each statement added another piece to the puzzle, showing that Judge Reynolds' experience wasn't unique. It was just the most visible example. The judge herself spent hours reviewing each detail of the lawsuit. Her experience on the bench had taught her the importance of thoroughness. She knew that every claim needed to be solid, every argument backed by evidence. This case wasn't just about winning. It was about creating lasting change. During depositions, the officers involved faced questions they couldn't dodge. With video evidence contradicting their statements, they struggled to explain their actions. Their usual excuses fell flat when confronted with clear footage of what really happened. Expert witnesses came forward, retired police chiefs, civil rights scholars, law enforcement trainers. They analyzed the footage, reviewed department policies, and provided detailed testimonies about how things should have been handled. Their expertise added weight to the case's central argument. This wasn't about individual officers, but about systemic problems. The courthouse press room was packed when the judge's legal team announced additional findings. They had uncovered internal memos, emails, and reports showing that department leaders had been warned about these issues before but had chosen to ignore them. As the case moved forward, it became clear that this lawsuit was different from others that had come before. It wasn't seeking just money damages, it demanded real reforms. New training programs, better oversight, community involvement in policymaking, and clear consequences for violations. Public support grew as more details emerged. People recognized that this case wasn't just about one judge's bad night. It was about making sure everyone was treated fairly by law enforcement. The lawsuit became a blueprint for how to push for meaningful change through the legal system. The judge's calm determination inspired others. She attended every hearing, reviewed every document, and stayed focused on the goal, not revenge, but reform. Her presence in the courtroom, now as a plaintiff rather than a judge, sent a powerful message about justice and accountability. The City Hall steps had never seen such a diverse crowd. Business people in suits stood next to students in backpacks. Off-duty teachers chatted with store owners. Retired police officers joined hands with community activists. All of them had gathered for one purpose: to support Judge Reynolds and push for real change. The morning sun reflected off hundreds of handmade signs. Some quoted the judge's own words from her years on the bench. Others showed simple messages of support. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, watching as the crowd grew larger by the minute. This wasn't just a protest. It felt more like a community coming together. Local shop owners brought coffee and water for the crowd. A nearby bakery handed out free cookies. Even the hot dog vendor, who'd been selling on this corner for 20 years, was giving away food. "This is about all of us," he said, waving away offered money. "We're all in this together." On the steps, community leaders took turns speaking. A retired police surgeon's voice shook as he described his own struggles to report misconduct during his career. A high school principal shared stories of her students' fears during traffic stops. Each speaker added another piece to a picture of a community ready for change. Inside City Hall, council members could hear the crowd through their office windows. The usual politics of delay and defer wouldn't work this time. The people outside weren't going away, and they weren't going to settle for empty promises. Judge Reynolds arrived without fanfare, walking through the crowd like any other citizen. People reached out to touch her shoulder, to share quick words of support. She stopped to talk with everyone who approached her, listening to their stories, holding their hands, sharing their hope for change. The convenience store clerk who had recorded the original video was there too. People treated him like a hero, but he kept saying he had just done what was right. His simple act of recording had sparked something much bigger than he had ever imagined. As the rally continued, small groups formed to discuss concrete actions. Teachers planned lessons about civil rights. Business owners organized support networks. Religious leaders coordinated community meetings. This wasn't just about protesting. It was about building something new. Local artists had created a huge mural on a nearby wall, showing scenes of community and justice. Children added their handprints in rainbow colors around the edges. The artwork became a symbol of what they were fighting for, a community where everyone felt safe and respected. When Judge Reynolds finally spoke, her words were simple but powerful. She talked about hope, about working together, about making sure that what happened to her would lead to positive change. The crowd fell silent, hanging on every word. This wasn't a judge talking from her bench. This was a neighbor sharing her dream for their community. The rally spread beyond City Hall. In neighborhoods across the city, people held their own gatherings. They shared meals, told stories, and planned actions. Living rooms became meeting spaces. Community centers stayed open late. Every conversation was about how to turn this moment into lasting change. Local businesses put signs in their windows supporting the cause. Coffee shops hosted discussion groups. Bookstores created displays featuring works about civil rights and community action. The movement was becoming part of daily life in the city. As evening approached, the crowd lit candles. The light spread across the gathering, a visible symbol of hope and unity. People sang together, prayed together, promised together that this time would be different. This wasn't just another protest that would fade away. This was the beginning of real change. The city had seen protests before, but this was different. This wasn't about anger. It was about hope. It wasn't about tearing things down. It was about building something better. And at the center of it all was a judge who had turned her own painful experience into a catalyst for positive change. The police department's main conference room looked different now. Instead of just uniforms and badges, the room was filled with a mix of people: community leaders, civil rights attorneys, police officers, and training experts. Old policies were being rewritten, not behind closed doors, but with everyone's input. Charts on the walls showed the new training programs. Officers would spend time in community centers learning about the neighborhoods they served. They would hear directly from people who had experienced unfair treatment. The goal wasn't to shame anyone, but to build understanding and trust. The new police chief, chosen with community input, walked through the halls with a different attitude. She stopped to talk with officers, asking about their challenges, listening to their concerns. Change wasn't just about new rules, it was about creating a new culture where everyone felt heard. In the training room, officers watched the video of Judge Reynolds' arrest, but now it was different. They weren't defensive anymore. They discussed what went wrong, how it could have been handled better. The incident had become a teaching tool, helping officers understand the impact of their actions. The department's complaint system was completely rebuilt. A new civilian oversight board was created with real power to investigate problems. Community members sat alongside police officials, reviewing body camera footage, examining policies, and making sure changes were real, not just on paper. Young officers found mentors in veteran cops who understood the need for change. They learned that being tough didn't mean being disrespectful, that authority came from trust, not fear. The old way of doing things was giving way to something new and better. The consent decree wasn't just filed and forgotten. Every week, teams checked progress against clear goals. Numbers were tracked, reports were public, and most importantly, community feedback was actively sought and listened to. Transparency became more than a buzzword, it became a way of operating. In roll call rooms, conversations changed. Officers talked about building relationships, not just making arrests. They shared stories of positive interactions, of problems solved without force, of trust being slowly rebuilt. The measure of good policing was shifting from numbers of tickets and arrests to community trust and safety. Technology played a role too. New systems made it easier to identify problems before they became serious. Body cameras were no longer seen as a burden, but as protection, for both officers and citizens. Data helped track patterns and spot potential issues early. The bias training wasn't just a one-time class. It became ongoing education, with real-world examples and practical solutions. Officers learned to recognize their own biases and how to prevent them from affecting their work. The focus was on understanding, not blame. Community meetings moved from the formal setting of City Hall to neighborhood centers, churches, and schools. Police officers and residents sat together, ate together, and most importantly, talked together. These weren't just formal discussions. They were real conversations about making their community better. The department's social media changed too. Instead of just posting about arrests, they shared stories of community engagement, positive interactions, and progress being made. They were honest about challenges and mistakes, building trust through transparency. Even the physical spaces changed. The police station's lobby was redesigned to be more welcoming. Interview rooms were made more comfortable. These small changes sent a big message. This was a place for the community, not just a place of authority. The officers who had arrested Judge Reynolds were gone, but their legacy remained as a reminder of why these changes were necessary. Their story wasn't used to divide, but to educate and improve. It showed how a painful incident could lead to positive transformation. 1 year later, Judge Reynolds sat in her chambers, looking at the framed newspaper article on her wall. It wasn't about her arrest anymore. It was about the changes that had come after. Her phone buzzed with a message about the latest group of law students arriving for her mentorship program. The program had started small, just a few students interested in learning about the law. Now it had grown into something bigger. Young people from all backgrounds came to learn not just about legal procedures, but about justice, fairness, and making real change happen. They saw in her story a path to transform systems from within. Down the hall, her courtroom had become a place where justice felt more accessible. People who came before her bench knew her story. They saw someone who had experienced injustice firsthand and still believed in the power of the law to make things right. Her experience had changed how she handled cases, making her even more careful to ensure everyone was heard. The courthouse steps, where protesters had once gathered, now hosted community education sessions. Police officers sat with residents, explaining laws and procedures. Legal aid volunteers helped people understand their rights. The space had been transformed from a place of protest to a place of learning and connection. In law schools across the city, her case had become part of the curriculum. Students studied not just what went wrong that night, but how one incident led to lasting change. They learned that real reform wasn't just about changing laws, it was about changing hearts and minds. The convenience store where it all started had become an unofficial landmark. The owner had put up a small plaque. On this spot, one person's courage began a movement. He kept the security cameras well maintained, knowing now how important they could be in protecting people's rights. Judge Reynolds' calendar was filled with speaking engagements, but not at fancy legal conferences. She spoke at community centers, schools, and police academies. She shared her story not to relive the trauma, but to show how change was possible when people worked together. Her old case files now sat alongside letters from people she'd helped. Young lawyers sought her advice not just about legal strategies, but about staying true to their principles. She had become more than a judge. She was a symbol of how to turn personal pain into public good. The police department's training program, which she helped design, had become a model for other cities. Officers from around the country came to learn how real community policing worked. They saw how treating people with respect made their jobs easier and their communities safer. In her spare time, she worked on a book, not about that one night, but about all the nights that came after. About how communities could come together, how systems could change, how justice could become more just. Her words gave hope to others fighting similar battles. The city had changed too. Trust between police and communities grew stronger. Crime rates dropped as people felt more comfortable working with law enforcement. Other departments started looking at their own practices, not wanting to wait for their own crisis to make changes. Every month, she met with the civilian oversight board she had helped create. They reviewed complaints, suggested improvements, and made sure the reforms stayed strong. But more importantly, they celebrated successes, moments when the system worked like it should. Her judicial robe felt different now. It wasn't just a symbol of authority, but of responsibility, to make sure what happened to her wouldn't happen to others. Each morning, as she put it on, she remembered that night, not with bitterness, but with determination to keep making things better. The final page of her story wasn't really final at all. It was just the beginning of something bigger, something that would continue long after her time on the bench was over. She had shown that one person's stand for justice could ripple out to touch countless lives.